standard or a best practice, and just sort of make it something that we are collectively thinking about as a community. So the way that kind of came about is sort of after the really high profile police murders of Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd, we had a lot of soul searching to do in the ASC, particularly about how we were talking about race, how we wanted to be a part of sort of anti-racist work, both on campus and in our community. And so it started with a small group of us who wanted to talk about how to be an anti-racist. And then it sort of got from our office to like the rest of the advising community, and then Aaron picked it up, and then it was like the whole community, which was super cool, but definitely not what we had planned. So we started with a first session where we just kind of talked about the book. Our goal going into it was we wanted this to be not just a reading group where we are like, oh yeah, we're doing like the work now, but we actually would sort of use this as an impetus for action and for rethinking institutional policies. And just like as a caveat, I don't know if you've noticed, I at least am extremely white. And so our group is sort of majority identifying, and that was not, in the spirit of trying to be white saviors by any means. A lot of it was just in conversation with my colleagues who identify as Black or Latinx. They were tired. They were real tired, and they did not want to do another thing. Recognizing that white supremacy is something that is white caused, and that it's really something that white people need to dismantle, as opposed to something that white people need to sympathize, with Black and Latinx folks. We recognize that this was something that was our responsibility. What I'm hoping is as we kind of pick up steam, like our group kind of diversifies, I would hate for this to end up sort of restricted to just white folks on campus. I would like to see, a more holistic community. As you're noticing this, if questions, it was not an intentional act of exclusion by any means. But yeah, so the first session was mostly about the book. We talked a lot about concepts that Kendi brings up in terms of how anti-racist work has to be kind of institutional. And right, it's at the policy level that there's work to be done in terms of changing people's attitudes or beliefs, but really at the end of the day, it's structural. And that is what we wanted to start paying attention to. So we looked at structure, kind of in the larger community, but also specific, particularly at how our hiring practices might white candidates over candidates of color. We wanted to go further with that, and then we had like a hiring freeze, so that we've got a pin on that one. But the third thing we talked about was curriculum development, and that seemed like something that would be really ripe for more conversation on campus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so part two of this continued on all of those themes that Kathryn was talking about, but more deeply examined, white supremacy, both in our daily lives, how we ourselves and our friends and families might experience it, and or through our own silence also perpetuate it. So what Kathryn was talking about with the ACTs and SATs, and how that can create hurdles for students not only getting into college, but into certain majors. We went more deeper into these topics to workshop them, see which ones we wanted to take further. And as she mentioned, the curriculum and syllabus rethinking or redevelopment sort of floated to the top. We also added, in addition to the ACTs, SATs, hiring practices, retention of people of color on campus. We talked a lot about the extra emotional costs and emotional labor that people of color, in particular faculty, staff, and students take on in, doing like diversity panels or panels altogether in comparison to their white colleagues, and how that's like a lack of pay surrounding there as well, and might circle back and lead to poor retention rates. So right now, currently, this syllabus and curriculum redesign is really what we have our eyes on. And how might it be integrated systematically at UAlbany? How can we shift culture through this discussion? And what we ended up talking about, and playing with this tension, right, of do we make systemic policy change? If we do, how so? Are we going to get kickback for making it mandatory versus, let's start at the ground floor, do something like a cultural shift that will eventually affect policy. So trying to come at it from both angles. So we had a lot of discussions around, are people on campus already doing this work that we just don't know about? So there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. So who else is out there? What else are people doing? And in that vein, who can be supporters and allies in this work? And then also to note, like, who might be, a hurdle in this work? Who might be, a source of resistance to anti-racism work on campus? Recognizing both are important. And as Kathryn mentioned, when Aaron reached out for us to do this, we really both saw it as an opportunity to really further elevate this topic, to the larger New Albany community, and see who else would like to be involved.
There we go. Yeah, so just kind of what makes curriculum anti-racist? So the sort of definition we're working with in its barest form is that it is a curriculum where you are elevating the voices and the scholarly work of Black, Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous writers and thinkers. And it's got a two-part, right? Like, that's part one. Part two is, in the process of doing that, allowing those voices and those ideas to really reshape your curriculum and your thesis for your class, so that you're challenging sort of where the white supremacist structures are in your field. And it's important for a couple of reasons. I think one big one is that representation is really important for students. I think we have a very diverse community of students at UAlbany, and it's important for many students to see themselves reflected in the texts that they are reading and working with. So that's one big one, but I also think it's about really changing the nature of your relationship with your field and recognizing the places where your field is upholding white supremacy or upholding structures of oppression, and finding ways of, like, kind of reorienting yourself to those structures so that you're questioning them and interrogating them as opposed to upholding them. And it's really important to recognize that this isn't about tokenism. It's if you are truly engaged in anti-racist curricular change, it's not about adding, right, like one Black writer, but it's like letting multiple writers of color reshape the way you are thinking about your topic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's also about being transparent in the development of your syllabus and your curriculum with students. So making it explicit to students the purpose of the work that you guys will be doing together in class, to make sure that they will have those skills and knowledge that they need to be successful in your course. And this doesn't by any mean, in any way mean you're making it like super easy for the students, but you're just ensuring that they aren't struggling to guess like what the assignments might entail or why they're learning a certain topic or theme or element, but it's relevant to their life. They can see these links of what they're learning in class connects to them personally, connects to what's happening in society, that might even connect to their major or their future, professional career goals. Aviva Bauer in Itlau shared a great article by Dr. Winkelmass that showed, in fact, that students do their best work and work their hardest when they do have clear understandings of the work. Again, its purpose and relevancy, that is required of them. So some key elements that I would suggest that you can consider for your own syllabus that the Winkelmass article recommended, and I'll share the article at the end here, is identifying purpose. So literally on the syllabi, writing out the purpose of certain texts, certain assignments, making it in a PowerPoint slide, saying this purpose multiple times in class or in a Zoom, because as you know, like, it's good to hear things once, twice, 3 times, and better. Students don't always, see that value, so we really need to provide it for them and, again, make those links. When students really see that intrinsic value and that purpose of the assignment or the reading, how it relates to them, their future, they're going to approach it in a more thoughtful manner rather than just doing the work to get it done. Often students, when they don't automatically see these connections, with all this prep work, they can get lost, they can get frustrated. And then, sometimes that frustration and that sense of feeling lost can, come back to the teacher with, emails or extra work or inconsistency in assignment preparation. So as instructors, we might be thinking, oh, like, why, is there this failure in my course? Why are students not following directions? Why is there poor quality work? And we can link it back to reflect on us. Like, what are we doing? What boundaries aren't we, setting or creating? What expectations are being lost? So it will create, an easier time for us as instructors later on when those clear expectations are set. So much of what we do thinking about transparency, in higher ed is normalized. I've been in higher education for 6 years now, and it really does involve like a multi-part cognitive process to be here. Like, we're always thinking, we're always assessing, we're always in this environment. And I think we can forget sometimes that students, especially like freshmen that come in, might not have the skills to, truly read an article or assess an argument, even identify an argument. We are all familiar with this campus and familiar with being here and comfortable being surrounded by other academics and students and professors. So we can't always assume that that's how students are feeling too. So checking in with them on those points as well might help you rethink how you approach your syllabus. And I would say overall, anti-racism work is part of social justice education that prioritizes the continual commitment to intentionally rethink and reconsider and actively challenge, societal norms at large, but also like classroom norms, which is what we're going to talk about today, that privilege some and not others. So again, like, we have that privilege, right, of being in this educational structure and being familiar and confident and comfortable, with classroom skills that some students just might not have yet. So this quote here on the next slide by Sensoy and D'Angelo, I'm going to pull my video screen over so I can read it. So they explain, working for social justice and education means guiding students and often being guided by students in critical self-reflection of their and our socialization into unequal relationships, an examination of the implications created by inequity, an analysis of normalized oppressive mechanisms, and the ability to change these hierarchies. Which really means, even after you've planned what seems to be like a perfect syllabus, right, before the semester starts, still, be open to change, be able to flex and adapt with that class and those students in front of you. Listen and learn from your students, make them active agents in their own learning, allow them to take leadership roles, maybe select texts or materials, try to let go of your power and control in the classroom to again, redistribute that to your students and make it a more cooperative process. There's, as Kathryn was saying, there's no like boxes to check here. There's no like anti-racist step-by-step guide or playbook. And you really can never say, oh, I've adopted all of these elements of being, anti-racist, so now my class is anti-racist. Does not work like that. Author Cornelius Minor explains that anti-racism is addressing the ideologies that govern schools. So it starts with me, right? Examining the biases that I bring into school and the discriminatory ideologies and structures that lead to the types of pedagogy that I engage in. He continues, it's about me disrupting the very curriculum that I teach, which can be really hard, right? When you've been teaching a similar curriculum all your life, how do you begin to disrupt that? So overall, there's no magic pill, there's no copy and paste perfect model. This work is really unique to every institution, every classroom, to all of you as instructors, and interesting combination of personal, individual, ideological, and systemic change.
Yeah, and Kira, is it Kira, I think, points out that sort of leaving room for flexibility is really key, that like, maybe I'm planning like 10 weeks and leaving 4 open, just kind of. I was talking with a colleague about this because I kind of always feel like I'm slightly behind and I'm like a little frazzled when I teach. And she pointed out that part of that is because I always try to meet my students where they're at. And when you're doing that, you're never going to feel like you know what you're doing because you're kind of perpetually trying to like flex to get to where they need to be.
Yeah. If you're feeling comfortable,
yeah,
then that's a problem.
Yeah. There was definitely a sense of like, I am terrible at this. She's like, no, you're just constantly changing. That's why you feel like you don't have anything beneath your feet. But yeah, I really like that idea. Yeah, a lot of this is kind of coming out of the Kendi book as well. Kendi suggests that there's kind of an 11-step cycle, like not, it's sort of the cycle in the way that like, 5 stages of grief go, where it's not really a cycle, it's like kind of stepping around them, where you start kind of at the policy level, it's as opposed to kind of at your own private place, and recognize that like racial inequity is a part of that policy, right? And so you have to kind of perpetually work to figure out what's causing it, right? Like identifying where it's coming from, where the effects are, right? Uncovering where that came from, trying to figure out where did these policies sort of emerge, and then sort of finding ways of challenging it, which I think is the stage we're at, where we've kind of identified the problems and we're starting to try to find anti-racist policies we can start implementing. So the next few steps are figuring out who's got the power in the institution, right? Starting to do educational work and trying to get people on board, and then starting to work with others in the university to start making this instituted. But as we kind of go, what we're recognizing is just what we're talking about, which is there's no stop point where you're like, okay, we got it, right? This is a sort of a practice of perpetual self-interrogation and perpetual institutional interrogation, where we're kind of constantly checking and seeing, right, what inequities have started coming up that we need to start addressing and revising. So if you haven't read the Kendi book, I think it was super helpful to the way we were thinking, and the way we've kind of designed this as well. Yeah, I thought I saw a chat. Hold on. Yeah. Yep. Kelly, I'm right there. Every day I leave class and I'm like, well, I have to change everything now. But yeah, I think that's actually a sign of really good pedagogy. So yeah, I'm just gonna bring up my notes on the other side so I don't lose my place. So there's a couple guidelines that we found in our discussion and as we've talked with faculty who are already doing this, that I think are, might be kind of helpful as you're rethinking your curriculum. The biggest one, of course, is who is represented on your syllabus. So our kind of suggestion is at least 60% of the text you're teaching by scholars of color, and if not, reshape it.
And thinking about UAlbany too, on our website, it states that like 54% of the students we have here are students of color. So our syllabus needs to not only reflect that demographic, and intentionally try to go beyond it, right? Most, if not all, knowledge provided to students, especially in secondary school and, the larger social discourse is from a white male, heteronormative, Eurocentric perspective. And it's normalized as the standard or as the truth to uphold as right or most valid. So it's really easy to find that perspective because it's accepted everywhere as truth. So we need to do the more difficult work of finding alternative voices. And sometimes it's actually not that difficult. It's just these, individuals weren't considered before. Depending on your field, it can be quite easy to find alternative voices. So, we need to offer more diverse representation, speaking to what Kathryn was saying earlier, diverse representation in knowledge producers so that our students can envision themselves producing knowledge too. And then thinking about the second bullet here, inviting speakers, who are Black, Latinx, and Asian or Indigenous to share their knowledge and work in class. It can really enhance classroom experience to have outside speakers and specialists come in, but be careful not to just sprinkle a token minority at the front of your classroom. Make sure that students come prepared to hear that knowledge, prepped with questions, with a reading they need to do ahead of time. maybe like even a post activity, a reflection of some sort where they are operationalizing that knowledge or that perspective to further appreciate its value and validity of what they have to contribute. And, you know, guest speakers, right, their time should be valued. And how we value things in a capitalist society today is through money. So we really need to put our money where our mouth is and make it a point to pay, you know, these guest speakers, especially if they're guest speakers of color. And making it a point, you know, if you have the power in your office or in your department to allocate resources and funds in a consistent manner for guest speakers, like do that. That's structural change. That's making a point to say that this is worth our money. This is worth the time to do. Aviva Bauer and Itlau explained, quote, "There are two ways you can shortchange guest speakers, literally without pay and then symbolically without appreciation of their knowledge." So make sure, you know, you're working to not do either of those.
Yeah, I apologize. I totally accidentally stole your first point as I was.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah, and really quickly before we go on, we've got some really good ideas in the chat that I just want to make sure we're seeing. Kira, can you tell us a little bit more about the sort of operationalizing knowledge that worked for you in the past as well?
Sure. I'm just looking back at what I wrote. What did I say? Oh, there it is. Yeah, I try. I've been working with Itlal since May of last year, throughout 2019, to really make it so that my students are doing the labor of learning, and I am not doing it for them. And so operationalizing the knowledge was piggybacking off of something you said. And I just have them, I don't tell them how to write. This is their time to explore that for 4 years. I don't tell them, you know. So notes, quotes, and questions. 1 page per assignment. Some write half a page. They're not very verbose. But if they do that, and some write like 4 pages, but I only look at 1. And then they do that 10 times throughout the semester of their choice. And they submit it as a portfolio, and they get to summarize what they learned at the end. So it operationalizes their, and I distinguish between knowledge and information, right? Information is just the thing you can read in the book or gather. Knowledge is the organization of that knowledge for an aim you have in life. And so for I'm African-American in case it's not clear. For students of color, for persons with disabilities, for trans or people who are sexual minorities, for them to be able to pursue something like I did in school. I want everything to focus on Blackness because my undergrad didn't focus on any of that. I want to be able to focus on those things. So notes, quotes, and questions allows me to operationalize my knowledge for what I want, not what the teacher wants. And then I end up learning so much from their papers, learning new ideas, sometimes I do it with YouTube videos because I'm a YouTube scholar. So find me a YouTube video that explains this concept better than I have.
Love it. Yeah, our students are such a wealth of knowledge. I always have at least 10 to 12 new materials or texts or videos or poems that I'm able to add to, you know, the following semester's syllabus, because, you know, they're almost the ones going out there and seeking that knowledge and bringing it back to class, which just enriches everyone's experience and access to knowledge. So thank you so much for sharing.
If I can add just one more thing, and I recommend orienting your students to Google Images for graphs and PowerPoints to help them learn concepts. So the questions are for things you don't understand, not just to ask some random question about, if YouTube didn't exist, what would it be like? I'm like, I want to cuss. Like, I don't know. It's like, I have no idea. So ask questions like, I don't understand that term. What is it? And then look up the answer in Google, in 3 dictionaries, and try to come up with your own note about what that is, and always cite, you know, notes, quotes, and questions. and always provide works cited at the end to practice the craft of being in the conversation with other scholarship.
Oh my God. This, if it is okay, I'm going to borrow all of that because
Please do.
I'm teaching a rhetorical analysis unit next, and I would like them to up the research.
And I got this from a friend of mine who has written 12 books, who just got his PhD for the first time, didn't do any other things. I was like, how did you write the 12 books? He was like, notes, quotes, and questions. I throw them all on the floor, and then I pick the things that are important, and I leave the rest behind. So it helps students to organize, which is knowledge, their own way of seeing what you're teaching, as opposed to them regurgitating what you think is important in your field.
Love that. Yeah, thank you. And that actually kind of ties in, Winsome actually had a question about kind of updating the physical spaces of academic departments as well. I don't know if, Winsome, did you want to maybe talk a little bit more about that and kind of what you had envisioned?
Hi, everyone. I was thinking specifically of what comes to mind is the chemistry department, for example, and the photos of the chemist who have been on that wall from I was a student here. So the physical space sends a very profound message. So you might have a syllabus, but how does the physical space counteract the syllabus? So considering physical as well as the content.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, we think about that a little bit in advising in terms of how we decorate our offices as well. Like if I am proclaiming a particular kind of anti-racist work in my advising, who do I have represented on my bookshelves? Who do I have represented on my walls? Right? Like what are the visuals that the students are getting? I think that's a really like well taken point as well.
And even how like furniture is positioned, you know, you don't want your desk chair behind the desk and your student in front of you, but maybe, you know, switch it around so your student can sit next to you and with you. I know when I go into classrooms, I'm not standing at a podium in front of the room. I'm putting chairs and desks in circles, and we're sitting in small groups and, you know, all at the same level, and constantly moving around and interacting with each other.
Just one more point. I hope I understand Kathryn correctly, but I want to see the authenticness of who you are and what your interests are. If I were to come into your office, that's something I've always admired about, you know, advisors, administrators. I learn about them and who they are. So I think there's a certain degree of representation that is what you referred to, but at the same time, what is you? So the public spaces is specifically what I was referring to.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I want to get to know who you are authentically by your space. And I can only ask questions about your work in Italy if I have seen that you've traveled to Italy. It's not necessarily a country in Africa which would show, you know, an underrepresented country, but it shows your interest. You get what I'm saying? So
yeah,
the public space is what I wanted to emphasize.
No, I think that is very true. Yeah, definitely worth kind of considering as well. Okay. Yeah, and oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you for considering my question.
Yeah, no, I think it's well considered. I think these are that we should all be thinking about more. And it kind of also ties into, you know, the next bullet point, oddly, which is just thinking about publication origin. Like what, you know, if we're teaching books exclusively from Cambridge and Oxford University, you're going to get one very particular kind of scholarship from tenured or tenure track faculty who, as we know, are kind of overrepresented white, right? Like thinking about different kinds of scholarly presses. I think Laura Tetro from the last session talked about a book on Incite, which was about kind of violence against Indigenous and Black and Latinx women. That is, I think it's from Duke, but it was very clearly not an academic press, or it was not an academic book. So thinking about who like is being represented by the kinds of presses that you were using, the publications, things like that. And is kind of related to that is the kind of content. And so thinking about, right, do you use YouTube? Are you using Google Scholar or like Google Images? Right, trying to find multiple mediums through which you can teach, because that's going to kind of decenter the like really text heavy white supremacist structures in your field, because you're taking more people in than just, right, like this sort of the preeminent, usually white scholars. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of this is designed to restructure the way your class is taught. And I think this actually, I was thinking about this in terms of what Winsome was talking about, because I started my freshman writing class, 10 years ago or whatever, and it was super white. It was like a lot of George Orwell. And over time, I have started taking out all of the white male authors and replacing them with bell hooks and Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa. And what I have found is my class is actually now a class about how academic writing is kind of racist. And that's not how it started. But it's actually changed the way I teach and the way I think about this as a writer and as someone who teaches writing. And that is, that is something that I think is becoming more and more part of who I am as a thinker. And I think at first it was perhaps a little stilted, but I think as I've gone, I have learned a lot about my field and the problems with it and how I want to engage with it as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I just want to backtrack on some of the.
Yeah, there's a lot of chats from Kyra, thank you so much. And Kelly, just suggestions for assignments.
Kira,
Oh, Kira, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, if you wanted to, go into detail on any of this, feel free. We'd love to hear a little bit more.
I'll put it in the chat. I'm responding to you all, so
Okay.
keep driving the car. I'm on for the ride.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, so that is kind of at the curricular syllabus level. We also wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how classroom conversations go. I think it is really about kind of an intentional interrogation and a questioning of yourself, and how you are maybe actively encouraging kind of anti-racist and anti-oppression themes. It doesn't kind of just fall in your lap. It's something you have to really work at, particularly if you identify as white, because you are constantly challenging all of the ways you have been taught to think. And right, making sure that they're there, that their conversations are happening. So, the sort of example we were thinking about was, right, if you're teaching public health, or if you're teaching kind of one of the upper level bios that are about, right, kind of a health science focus, right, this would be a great time to talk about health disparities in health outcomes for different communities of color, in terms of access and sort of the racialized way doctors treat particularly Black women, right? And making sure that that's part of the conversation. And I think my sense is it's okay if it's a little awkward and uncomfortable. I think it's something that takes some practice if you are not used to talking about it. If you are just waking up and figuring out how to make this part of your pedagogy. I'm teaching this Uni 100, which is the freshman, and it's kind of like a how to get like situated at UAlbany. And we had a day where we were going to talk about like multiculturalism, but when we asked them in their kind of, what are you passionate about? Tell me who you are. Most of them said that they already care about Black Lives Matter. They care about anti-oppression work. And I thought, okay, we're way past culturalism. And so we just kind of had a conversation. And what most of them said was, I'd ask them, what do you need to feel supported on campus? And most of them said, we just want to know that our faculty are thinking about this. We want to know that they're talking about this. We want to know that it's in the back of their head. And so I think what you will find, if this is something that is new for the way you were thinking about scholarship, is college students are real patient with faculty. They're really willing to let you do the comfortable work of figuring it out. And they're willing to have you kind of stumble through it a little bit, so long as you are talking about it. So my sense is do it even if it feels awkward. It will eventually not feel awkward.
Mm-hmm. I think students too really appreciate when you practice what you preach in the class. In my Food and Social Justice in the Americas course, social justice is a key theme, but we're not just thinking and talking about it. We actually try to do it on campus by questioning, Sodexo on campus and, workers' rights in the campus center, like making it again relevant and usable to them right away. And as Kathryn said, it changes your whole class over time, which is a great, student-led part of this process. So here I have just some common struggles that you may face or you may, hear from people along the way in your department or office as, anti-racism work is trying to, be done. So sometimes you might hear people say they want to remain neutral. So they see social justice as radical or too political. However, being neutral is inherently political, right? We are all political in what we do or choose not to do. Politics affects our lives and the institutions in which we serve. We cannot be outside of it. And by saying that you are, quote, not political or don't care about politics, really just means that you have the privilege, not to care, that you have enough advantages or power in society to buffer yourself from the changes that policies make. So to that point, social justice exists outside of politics. It is a part of basic human rights, though it is taken up by political parties in differing degrees. But in all, social justice means, better lives for everyone, despite the political meanings. And then thinking about number 2 here, some people may feel jealous or hold some resentment. They have, been treated unfairly if others make gains with inclusion and justice initiatives. They may say, oh, well, I didn't get that, or I struggled, so it's a part of life. Why shouldn't they struggle too? It will be good for them. However, times have changed, right? New struggles exist today. We got a different economy, different social issues, different political climate. And, who are we to ensure that someone else struggles, right? That struggle may have helped you along, but how do you know that struggle will help them too? How do you know they're not struggling, somewhere else? And, as human beings, if we can undo, struggle and instead create a learning experience based on, mentorship, advice, or guidance, isn't that more helpful than keeping that structure in place to ensure that they struggle just because you struggled? So it's definitely a common phrase I hear when, at least in my personal experience, when I begin to talk about social justice work. Number 3 here, we're all going to make mistakes. We will fail. You get back up and, move on. Everyone does. I just say, remember, when you do mess up, breathe, reflect, apologize if someone is telling you that they are hurt or that you unintentionally triggered another person. Say thank you to them for bringing it to your attention, and then reflect some more on that learning experience so you don't do it again. I mean, you might do it again, but at least now you'll have some parameters on what to do to fix it, to move on, to use it, to make your work better. Sitting with, guilt or shame really serves no one, right? That paralysis, that inaction serves no one. Silence is compliance, right? With current power structures until you say or do otherwise. And as, a white person myself, and especially with the increased Black Lives Matter movement and white people wanting to be a part of that and wanting to support it, I've noticed a lot of white friends and colleagues, they're at this moment where they're reading and they're listening and they're learning and they're reading more and they're listening more and they're learning more, which is great. But at some point, you have to move on to action. So just keep that in mind. you identify as white and you feel like you've been hearing a lot of these things before and you're wanting to contribute more, maybe it's time to start to co-facilitate or co-lead, or get out and do something more than just continue to read and to learn. And we should all continue to do that, but we have to pair it with some sort of action-oriented agenda. Bullet 4 here. So it's not part of my job, right? So this person really sees new initiatives or attempts or conversations to promote change or surrounding social justice as this extra work, completely unrelated to what they do. Because of, one of these other bullets or a mix of different scenarios mentioned here. But in our globalized, interconnected world, though it may not be explicitly listed, in the job description to challenge structures of inequity and work towards more equitable processes, if you intentionally choose not to make change, right, you are knowingly impeding others' success and thus, our overall success in the office, in the department, in the institution, in the larger community. And connected to this 4th bullet is this 5th one. So where you have, it's not my job because someone really might not care about social justice issues and they see themselves as disconnected from it. Then you have another type of person who is like, oh, I got it. And they might think they know it all. And they might say they do, and they might attend the training, but then not follow through on it later on. Or they might be caught up in the busy day-to-day running of the office or running of the business. So saying that they do know it all or that they did the training, it can almost be a defensive mechanism for feeling maybe insecure about the material. So, check yourself, check people in your office. It's really, this last one, number 5, is probably one of the most common areas where structural change gets stuck. When we all get overwhelmed in the routine of our day-to-day in our offices, in our classrooms. Sometimes we're just trying to see students, we're just trying to get the grading done, we're just trying to get the programming out, regardless of the larger impact on students. If what we're doing maybe unintentionally is perpetuating injustice, maybe we don't see it, or maybe some of us might be intentionally looking the other way or just be too busy to care. So think on that. These are definitely common. I've heard all of these at UAlbany, but in the end, we are all busy, right? And to make anti-racism work, we have to make it a priority, and that will involve change and rethinking not only of our day-to-day behavior, but the structures within our office.
Yeah, sorry, there's a lot of really great stuff also in the, yes, Gaunt is like giving us knowledge. I tried to click on it and then at some point it sort of took away all the stuff, but I'm just wanted to point out that Dr. Gaunt's book has been sort of as a recommendation by Christine Vassallo-Obi. And I just wrote it down, so I really appreciate it. Yeah, and I think this is also your slide.
Yeah. So Ijomo Luo says that we have to keep race and racism on the table, right? We need to seek changes that advance progress every week, every day, not just to fill a quota or to look good, enough on first glance or because that is what is expected, but to build equity into our decision-making process. So to ensure that, this work is always at the front of our minds, even with the tiniest changes to an assignment or a syllabus. The more we incorporate anti-racist decision-making into the smaller day-to-day, the more easy it will be to enact it on a larger scale. And those little day-to-day actions can really, accumulate to also make larger change as well. This next slide, I think, again, is just a good spectrum to have at the back of your mind when thinking about how you operate and how maybe your department or office operates in general. But we go from the left here, from colorblind to diversity only to race tentative to equity focused. So a learning continuum for race-focused work. So colorblind, referring to a person that might, quote, not see race or consider it as a factor in socioeconomic inequities. So this organization or this person really tends to think, you know, what is good for everyone will just inherently be good for people of color too. This you know, approach really doesn't lift up issues of equity and diversity and inclusion in any, you know, regular or routine way, and often, you know, believes lifting up or discussing race will only create conflict. And sometimes it might be guised by that phrase, like, we are all part of the human race, you know, love is love, which, you know, it's a nice thought, but often a complicated statement, because not all of us are treated equitably and as a part, you know, of the human race in that statement, especially with, you know, the current happenings with Black Lives Matter, which, you know, is holding a beacon to that point that not all lives matter equally. So saying even that phrase of, you know, we are all part of the human race can bring up a lot of, you know, that's like hurtful feelings for people. And then shifting over to diversity only. So this might represent an organization or person that recognizes the value of diversity in the workplace. They may feel that like doing diversity work will allow other goals to fall in place and move their organization forward. At the same time, this organization or person might also think that diversity can be a lot of work, that it's labor intensive, that there's really no space, you know, in the day-to-day to address these issues. So it can go either way with that diversity only approach. Race sensitive, this is sort of where many people find themselves when I enter, you know, spaces like this with people like all of you here. You know, this person or organization finds that racial disparities are really troubling. They know something needs to be done, but maybe just aren't sure like how to act just yet, or are already on this process of acting. They may take, you know, some steps in the way of outreach, you know, but maybe without like this follow through of change. Sometimes these attempts are like last minute. They might be unsustainable with no follow through. Maybe for times like for show or when something's trendy. So we need to be careful in this part of the spectrum. You know, we don't want diversity and racial equity becoming a box to check or a quota to be filled, or a flashy term to throw around. So, you know, a lot of us are here, and I offer this criticism to call out what even we're currently doing in this moment, right, to make it better, because we are so close, like, to meaningful and sustainable change, you know, when we do something like our talk today, but where does it go from here, right? How will this continue and snowball into something larger? And then lastly, this equity focus, this organization or person is race intentional. So this means recognizing that virtually all programmatic and operational functions must be race informed or socially justice based in order to advance the organization's overall mission or the course's overall objectives, right? So in this spot, you know, social justice, anti-racism work is kept on the table all the time as an integrated, you know, part of the system, part of the institution in day-to-day contexts. So looking at the spectrum, you can slide back and forth on this scale. It's not a one directional flow. So with all this in mind, you know, Kathryn and I will now explain, you know, how we're going to use a lot of this knowledge and these experiences and these author statements as we move forward to breakout groups. So I'll let Kathryn take that on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like that is one of my favorite figures. It has really helped me kind of rethink how I am doing things. But I think one of the things that I really appreciate about this conversation is how many folks are really thinking about education from the perspective of how do we bring students in as kind of co-workers, I guess, in this colleagues. I don't know if colleagues is quite the right word, but like we are kind of bringing them into this work as well. So one of the great things about this particular presentation is we have a ton of undergrads who are listening in. Junior peers, I love it. Yes, I will call them junior peers. Many of them are my students, and I'm really excited they're here. So what we thought we would do for the second half of this session would be to kind of make this a kind of a workshop. So we thought for maybe the first 20 minutes to half an hour, we could break out into groups and just kind of workshop either your syllabus or your curriculum, you know, either with each sort of a particular lesson, right? Something that you were working on in a curricular fashion. And because there will be like undergrads, right, our junior peers, we can ask for their kind of, where are they at? You know, that's one of the things that I think I'm hearing is that we want to hear where students are at and how we can meet them in this work. So if it's okay, I'm going to, yes, definitely don't hesitate to ask students for ideas, right? That makes your teaching better. I agree. I feel like I get better every semester because I ask students what is helpful, what is not helpful. So I'm going to go ahead, for folks who want to stay for the second half. We're going to start with a little workshopping. I'm going to put folks in groups of about 5, and then we're going to come back together, talk a little bit, and then we are hoping to have a conversation about how we can maybe start doing this at a policy institutional level at UAlbany. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. If you need to leave, that is totally okay. I just realized I do not have I do not have access to breakout groups. So maybe that's not going to work. Kathy, do you have them? If not, we can just kind of share as a group.
I made you a host. I don't know if that will help. And I don't know how many people we have left. Oh, we have 20 people left.
That's good.
I mean, what do you think about breakout groups or one solid group?
Yeah, let's do one solid group, just because I think people have to kind of come in and out.
Yeah, I feel like some people might scoot out too. Yeah, no, we're
Yeah.
19.
Yeah, we totally get it. This is a
Yeah.
lot. Yeah, so I don't know if folks have things they want to do. Kira, thank you so much. This is like, we should have just turned it over to you, because
No, you're the inspiration. Thank you so much. This is one of the best things that I've seen us do since I've been here for 3 years. So thank you.
Fantastic. We will definitely be in touch. Thank you. Yeah, does anybody have any curricular stuff they want to talk about or kind of workshop with the group? It's also okay if not.
Mhm. I know we're like already 3 weeks into our fall semester, and it might be difficult to like throw changes in right away, but you know, does anyone have any ideas even for rethinking their syllabus for the spring? Maybe if not for the fall, that might be easier. I'm not really sure.
I have a question. This is Sarah Cohen speaking. I'm the chair of the Art and Art History Department. And what about those of us who teach pre-modern historical material? How would you recommend, especially focused on Europe? Now, there has been a little bit of work done on issues of racism, white supremacy, and so forth in the literature, certainly the primary sources in pre-modern eras in Europe, but it's not front and center the way it might be when you're studying, for example, contemporary art history. Do you have any recommendations?
Yes. So my specialization area is 16th century English literature, religion, and poetry. So I am right there with you. It's a real white field. And partially I'm very thankful that my field is starting to kind of talk about this. We have early modern critical race theory. I feel like, I know Dr. Murakami had to step off, but she would be a great person to talk to as well, as she's kind of thinking about this. What I've sort of seen recommended is, even if you can't find, right, like particular art that is done by people of color, because that's not who our fields have elevated. That's not the canon that we have access to. Is thinking about how to interrogate whiteness within that canon, and sort of seeing, right, like where, you know, in my field we talk a lot about, I do stuff with like Protestantism versus Catholicism, and looking at the ways that those two have been, those two kind of ideologies became ways of upholding white supremacy in culture kind of led to, right, like empire and colonization in the 19th century. So what I think what we can do at the moment, particularly if our fields are really, really deeply embedded in sort of like primarily white culture, is thinking about how to interrogate whiteness within the canon that we have, and looking for like, where does this set up certain historical trends that have kind of led to us to where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know much about the art history world. I think Dr. Murakami would probably be a better resource than me, because I know she's thinking about that in terms of like medieval Renaissance for like the 3-person major that we have that's MedRen, and how to sort of think about that. Raison, tell us, talk to us.
Hi. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I'm like supposed to be also engaging in this, but I thought it was really cool. So I don't know. I had something that I wanted to say. I'm actually in Dr. Murakami's British literary class. And what I've realized that I would actually really like to do in a class like that, and in a class that primarily focuses on like, you know, the white aspect of the past, because that's all that is being looked at, and like that's what was recorded, but it's not like people of color didn't exist during that time. So I'm sure that there are small hints and clues that are throughout everything and throughout history. And we did it actually with gender, but while I was looking at those texts, and I'm not sure if it's in art history, but it could be, is we were looking at the small hints and clues that pointed towards the norms that they had back then. So with those norms, then if you can find like specific clues and hints that points towards how they treated people of color, or just like the entire social construct of like the culture and society back then you can compare it to today's world, or point out the differences, and you could just basically talk about it. I don't know, I think that would be really cool, like if you can just like look at everything back then and pick out the clues that's being recorded and based off of what's there.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, that's my Steve.
And
Yeah.
Sarah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Sarah, it already sounds like you're, you know, working towards like problematizing and having complex conversations about this in your field, and even just making it a point to define with multiple definitions, like what white supremacy is or what racism is, and using those terms and encouraging your students to use those terms and talk about them when talking about the art and how it might perpetuate white supremacy or perpetuate racism. That's really important too. Just normalizing that conversation and saying those words in class.
Right, yes, thank you. It's tricky when the people themselves were so distant from that way of thinking, but you're absolutely right. It sets the foundation for today. So yeah, I definitely see the importance of that. Thanks.
I always feel like it's hard because I mean, I'm only speaking from my own field, and I was trained as a historicist, and so much of my training was about look at the text that was there, right? Like look at the medium that was there, and so much of the anti-racist work like I've been trying to do is very contemporary, or it's like very much rooted here, and so I've had to really rethink how I do historical work. And I've had to really rethink the paradigms. Like I teach Spencer's Fairy Queen occasionally, and it's the whitest of white texts. But there's a contemporary fiction writer who does like speculative fiction. His name is Saladin Ahmed, and he did this really cool short story from the position of these 3 characters who are brothers who were kind of orientalized, like vaguely Muslim, but we're not really sure. And so he told the story of the fairy queen from their perspective, as opposed from like the super white like figure. Not at all historical, but I'm finding that including that on my syllabus really helps students rethink what was missing in the text. But part of my historical training was like, oh no, like it's not a primary text. What are you doing? And so having to rethink. It's not easy. It's like killing an old part of yourself.
Is anyone worried about meeting any kind of like resistance in making these changes, you know, within their department or within themselves? Anything you wanted to like talk out through here? Or maybe any new ideas about anti-racist assignments that you would like to get a second or third or 20th opinion on?
I had this question just about notions of rigor and how can we rethink that and like what does that exactly mean to rethink rigor in like an academic setting?
Do you mean like the rigor to like write an article?
I guess I'm not 100% sure what I mean. It's just I guess, you know, like thinking about like literary texts and bringing in, you know, writers of color or, you know, artists of color, Black artists, etc. I think I was thinking about it just after looking at these white supremacy culture characteristics. I'm not sure if you've seen those, but you know, things like maybe like how to have high expectations without expecting like perfectionism, things kind of along that area.
So breaking down that like white supremacy culture in the classroom of like expecting people to start on time and like being there on time and that everyone sits silently in rows and raises their hand versus like constant talking or like speaking out. Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
I've definitely seen those extensive lists of like white culture traits in the classroom. They're like an easy Google away if anyone's interested in like what is on this list. But as is it Burley?
Yeah.
So referring to all of these tiny things that create extra hurdles and struggles for our students of color within the classroom, just in like how we act, how we position our body, how we speak, our tone, even, you know, speaking to what Winsome said earlier, the physical setup of a public space, all sort of support this standardized white culture and often not, what's it called, interrogated in conversations of, you know, changing the curriculum, right? Because we're talking about changing assignments and changing curriculum, but we have to remember to change also our behavior and our attitudes and our own culture that we have fostered and we cultivate in the classroom. Thinking about rigor, I mean, in my opinion, the rigor it takes to write an article and to get like an article published, and the rigor that it takes to create like a piece of art. I'm not really sure how you can like effectively measure that, right? But I think in presenting these different types of materials, having the questions and the follow through and the preparatory work done to consider both with the same intensity and the same rigor, I think is an important step to take and to tell your students to take as well. Like make sure you highlight the fact of like the rigor that you're taking in that process. I'm not sure if that's helpful or if anyone else wants to speak to this question of rigor, but that's what I think of. I hold all of these pieces of knowledge, you know, as knowledge in their own right. And when we interrogate them in the classroom, I work to hold them all, you know, to the same sets of questions and, you know, level of intensity when you know, introducing them with other materials and course texts. Yeah, I don't know, Kathryn, if you.
No, I was just going to say Jennifer Wilcox had a question. I didn't know she wanted to jump in.
Yeah, please.
Oh, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to just ask or I didn't want to interrupt anyone. I just had a question about something you said about whiteness and like all of these expectations. I was just confused, like what do those expectations, like being on time or sitting silently, like is there like some historical context? Like how is that related to whiteness?
Yeah, so those are all like quintessential elements of like what white culture expects in the classroom that has just been normalized to like fit every culture. So not every culture, not every person, you know, sits in straight lines to learn, or raises their hand, or sits silently and listens, or arrives on time. Like time is a very fluid concept or construct in a lot of cultures. So some like of our students, they might come late to class, and you know, as like a white person, I might be thinking like, oh, you know, if I am, you know, 2 minutes late, it's like a huge deal to me. But to students, like it might not be that big of a deal. And that used to really like irritate me. And I used to close my door and I would lock it right at 10 a.m. if my class started at 10 a.m. to like structure the classroom in this certain way. And then I realized like, oh shit, that's like a tenet of like whiteness and like white supremacy in the classroom. So now I make sure to leave my door open, and I make it a point to start about 5 minutes later to allow, you know, those students who might not have that same culturally constructed respect or consideration of time, right, to be there when I begin talking about the important things in class. So the first 5 minutes of class, you know, I'm not sitting there in silence, but I'm getting to know my students. You know, I'm talking about what we'll do today. I'm, you know, asking students, you know, what did they do over the weekend, trying to build a rapport and using that time, you know, efficiently, but making sure, you know, in 5 minutes after the hour happens, or, you know, 8 minutes after the hour happens, then I can dive into the important announcements of the day, and those students who are kind of trailing and trickling in aren't missing that information because of my, you know, assumed like standards of what a classroom should look like. But again, if you just Google like white supremacist behaviors in the classroom, there's 2 or 3 articles and just like lists, like image lists that I've seen floating around, and they're quite illuminating because we normalize them so much, especially as white people, and you don't even think that that's an issue, and then you're just blown away, and it changes how you operate and interact with your students for the better.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
And it looks also like Kelly had a question. Maybe no longer. Oh, no. I guess not. Okay, well, if Kelly comes back, we can do that. But I was also thinking about that in terms of, I took a counseling class earlier this summer, and one of the things they pointed out is that counselors like to make a lot of eye contact. And like, because it's a sign of like, I'm engaged with you. Certain cultures, eye contact is actually a sign of great disrespect. So, you know, sometimes counselors will be sitting with a client and we'll be like, why aren't they making eye contact? And it's because that's a sign of respect, is to not do that. So yeah, things like that as well. Yeah. Other questions about syllabi, curriculum? I've also thought a lot, Burley, about like, what does rigor mean in my classroom? And I thought a lot about it during the pandemic when, right, some of my colleagues were like, well, what about the integrity of a B? And I'm like, the B is fucking made up. It's not real. It is a fake standard we have come up with. Right? So like recognizing that a lot of the standards of what constitute rigor, right, are designed to sort of let certain people get ahead and certain actions get ahead, and certain, at the end of the day, what I think a lot of us are really dedicated to is meeting students where they're at. And my standard of what you should have learned in my class, right? Like we kind of have to play that game because we've got standards and we've got like, you know, institutional requirements and whatnot. But part of my I think part of what Kira was talking about that I thought was really cool was what is it that you as my student, what do you value and what do you want to learn, and what direction can you take that, as opposed to you meeting my standard of what I think of as rigor, which honestly differs from person to person. So it's not even a fair scale. So I always try to reframe my thinking from how do they meet a certain standard to how can I meet them at their kind of place of what they need out of this class.
And an example from my own class, we'll have so I'm doing an asynchronous course right now, but I wanted to like do weekly check-ins with my students. And in these weekly check-ins, I expect them to talk for 10 to 15 minutes about, you know, the readings or the texts, just so I can kind of assess where they are, you know, with the readings. Now, some students love this. They love to talk and they love to, you know, walk me through verbally what they're doing. Other students like just can't do it. They don't like Zoom. They feel awkward, you know, presenting and talking to people. So instead I'll have them like keep a journal, and like they're still answering the same questions I would be asking my students in like this verbal Zoom check-in, but they're able to really highlight their own academic talents, right? That they're great writers, maybe not so much great with like verbal speaking or communication skills. So that's just one way I try to meet students where they are, to really highlight like what they want to contribute to class and feel comfortable in contributing.
Yeah. I like something called, I've been trying this the last few semesters and I really like it. It's called grading contract, where instead of being like, you know, your grade is based on my assessment of your work, it's more like if you turn in everything, right? Like you turn in all your assignments, all your drafts, all your final drafts, you get a B, period. If it's particularly stellar work, it will go above that. But that way, their grade isn't based on like my definition of quality, because they might be writing a paper and they need, you know, they need to learn certain conventions, but at the end of the day, I'm hoping that they get what they need out of it. And so long as they do the work, they get the grade. And I don't care what that work looks like. Please don't tell St. Rose I said that, because I really need this adjunct position. Yeah, but like, you know, anything above and beyond that, or like proof that they've done like well above what is required, will get B plus A minus. But pressure is off. They don't have to figure out what they need to do to get a grade from me. It's like, just turn in the work. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, and if anyone's feeling like overwhelmed with like the amount of work it might take to make these changes, again, like your students are resources. If you don't have time to like go out and search for all of these alternative resources and text materials for your course, you can make that like your first assignment in your class. Be like, you know, I'm teaching this course on food justice, you know, who do you want to learn about that is, you know, talking about food justice, or teaching, or making videos or songs, or you know, cooking shows about food justice. You know, find 3, you know, resources or materials, you know, let's do an analysis of each, why you think they would be important for class, and then, you know, how can we use them moving forward? Or you can keep them in your back pocket and add them for your syllabus for the next semester. And what I found is that students really enjoy knowing that they're creating, you know, like academically structured like curriculum. They like being a part of it and knowing that it's going to be used down the line, and even within their own class. And even, so I have this one assignment called a zine, where students make these mini pamphlets on a topic of their choice, and, you know, we'll incorporate some, you know, author's texts along with their own personal experiences and other materials. And then I'll reuse those zines that those students make. I'll have them trade with each other and sort of grade and evaluate each other's work. And then those same zines get used in the following semester as like text for the course to read. So once you get in this cycle of like co-learning and co-teaching together, a lot of the work, I guess, it doesn't seem like work, because then it just becomes this sustainable cycle of, you know, reusing and recollecting and I don't know, growing your resource bank, which is nice.
Yeah. I think if there, unless there are other questions, I think maybe if we move to the next part, which we were hoping we might do a little crowdsourcing about, you know, yeah, our goal really in our little group is we would really like institute or like suggest these kinds of the things that we've been talking about, the anti-curricular changes, and find ways of kind of instituting it as like a best practice at like kind of a policy level. We are mindful that since many of us are staff, we don't know a whole heck of a lot about faculty politics. So we're trying to figure out, is this something that we go through the union? Do we go through the faculty senate? And also, how do we make this a culture change where people want to do this, and it's not just like, right, like I don't want anyone. I think this is kind of what Winsome was talking about. Like, we want folks to be authentic in their teaching and in their advising and their work here. And so if this isn't kind of part of their authentic experience, it could be pretty stilted. But we want to see, what are some ideas? How would we go about doing this? Most importantly, who is already doing this work, so we're not like stepping on their toes or walking over their heads when they've clearly been doing this for years.
Could I ask a question at this point? I've been wondering about this for a while now during the discussion, and now I feel is perhaps an appropriate time to ask this. I've found over the many years that I've been here that we have been increasingly asked to specify what they call the learning objectives for our classes. And this factors into the very, very tight controls the university is exerting over the assessment of learning objectives and how student outcomes match the learning objectives. This is all a procedure that anyone who's been teaching at the university in the past 10 years is probably all too familiar with. And it strikes me that this notion of codifying in advance the learning objectives for a class, it could open things up if done with this kind of goal in place for creating an anti-racist curriculum. It could also be done in such a way that I think could really limit it. For example, I really like the idea of simply asking students, what are you seeking to learn in this class? I've actually never thought of just bluntly asking my students in that way, what are you seeking to get out of this class? I always feel as if, well, it's up to me. I have to itemize. This is what, this is the skill you're going to walk away with. Students will gain a knowledge of this, and students will gain experience in that, because that's what learning objectives ask us to do. That's how they ask us to frame everything. So I wonder if we could think about ways of perhaps reframing that whole learning objective model, since that's the one the university uses as the basis for all their assessment. And I would assume that anything that went through the Senate would also have to subscribe to that kind of protocol. How could this sort of really different upending approach to potentially upending approach be integrated with what the university requires in terms of specifying these learning outcome objectives?
Great question, Sarah. And even thinking about the setting of goals and objectives, that's also like a very white culture approach to education. I think you're right. And I think maybe instead of focusing so closely on these like set objectives, maybe we should be thinking about what sort of processes we want our students to experience in our courses. And, starting with that question you asked, like, what are you seeking to learn here or get out of this course? And then considering what type of process we might take together to achieve that, versus setting these pre-made objectives that all students are held accountable to and must meet, which we know doesn't happen in all contexts and puts immeasurable pressure on both us as the instructor and students, and maybe needless pressure in some cases, right?
I also worry about, because I've been thinking about the objectives too, and I feel like I don't have a good answer. And I was also really thinking about in terms of academic freedom, because I want to make sure that these aren't like something that we're sort of imposing from the top down. Particularly because I think not just that we would run into issues, but because I value academic freedom and I don't want to like force this in a way that would trample on that. And I think that's a slightly different issue than the outcomes issue. But I think it's kind of at the same institutional level of, is there a way to do this at a culture level that's not at a policy level? I don't know. I don't feel like I have a good answer for that, but I think it's a well brought up point of, is this something that we should sort of avoid modifying and just kind of leave it as best practices recommendations? And I don't know enough about faculty politics to know this, but if we do that, is that something that would then bleed into a sort of learning objectives?
Or what if maybe we put in smaller changes, like making, anti-racist elements or student-based, student-centered learning, something included in like the tenure track portfolio that's like reviewed and held to a similar standard as like research. How can we reward teachers for taking initiative and motivating themselves to make these changes versus, creating this policy that all of a sudden people have to like check off their list, right? Because we don't want a bunch of hollow statements on, people's syllabi about anti-racist teaching that just gets copy pasted, inserted and left like, oh, I did that. So, I mean, somehow of creating like a mechanism of reward and recognition, in taking the initiative to do these. I think it might be a blend of both, right? Like making smaller policy changes and doing these smaller cultural shifts, coming at it from both ends, I think is an opportunity to consider.
Yeah. If it's okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I haven't spoken this whole time because I am neither from Albany or an academic. I'm actually former chapter president, and I'm the sole remaining member of the old affirmative action committee trying to hold on to all things diversity. And because I am on the faculty senate, essentially, that's where I figure administration is going to give us the floor. Because on all things academic freedom, they always turn to the union. Oh, ask them, So that'll be me again, It's like the only time I'm visible in the room is when they want to, tiptoe around that. So on that, I'm relying on you guys. That's actually, I've been taking notes. But the one sticky wicket is enforcement versus, policy versus culture. And that's the only blank that I have here. I keep coming back to incentivize to normalize. And until the culture changes. I could give you a really bizarre example. Not until we had literally a nursing mother, an academic who didn't take the whole semester off. She gave birth in the middle of the semester, and little things. We were all given glass doors to protect students from whatever behavior, yada, yada, yada. So when they remodeled the buildings, we lost all privacy. All the office doors are now clear glass. Okay, you can still have a private conversation, but people can see, that you're there and so on and so forth. Now she needed a little bit of time to get the baby, nurse the baby, and take him back to daycare. That's when all of a sudden we had a single male faculty member who wanted the same rights as the nursing mother. He wanted the rights to cover his window when she had temporary permission to cover her window. And of course, calling the union, we don't want to be the police of these things, but sometimes, how do you tread those waters is all I'm asking.
Yeah.
And that was like the biggest chunk of Kendi Part 2 discussion. We're navigating those tensions of punishment and reward. There's no answer, there's no copy and paste model we can use. I mean, personally, I think it's a little bit of mix of both. I think it's a little bit of policy change and a little bit of cultural change at the same time, but that's just me. I would love to hear what everyone else thinks. You know,
do you think there's any objection to incentives? Do you anticipate, oh, how come I can't get, you know, whatever? Is there any reluctance to incentives?
I mean, I'm sure there are. I don't want to say there aren't, but I think we won't know until we try, and I am all for trying.
I was also thinking one of our kind of to-do lists for our group is myself and one of the other group members are going to go talk with like the provost and a couple of other offices on campus just to kind of sort of take a temperature and see, like, you know, this question exactly, like what kinds of resistance might we get to incentives. Like how would we want to start instituting this as like a culture change, or like how would we want to start promoting it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, we're wondering that too. Yeah, but I think it's helpful to have that language of like incentive versus policy, or like reward versus you know, enforcement. But I think that's something, if it's okay, I'm going to take some of those questions with a couple of those meetings and just be like, these are things that we are concerned about.
One in particular, because I was trying to think of some, and for each one, I'm smacking my own wrist. I don't know why, but a shorter distance to tenure. You guys have extra credit as teachers. Is there such a thing in the promotion process? You know, slippery slope. How does that not become a requirement then? You know, see why I'm smacking? So,
no, we did the same thing. Yeah, no, we were right there. Our first discussion, someone was like, we should make this mandatory. I'm like, you're not going to make this mandatory. Like, that's not going to happen.
The greatest resistance to it will be making it mandatory. It's just going to get the opposite effect.
Yeah, that's going to make people, you know, like, this is the same thing. It's just, I think, a human nature. When somebody tells you have to do something, you're like, well, I'm not gonna. Like, so, right? How do we make this something? We were trying to come up with ways of like, how do we get faculty to want to do? Like, how do we make this a benefit to them to do? You know, and we recognize we're not going to get everyone on board. Right. But we want more folks on board.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if it's okay, I'm going to bring some of those questions with me, some of those meetings, and just be like, hey, what do we think?
And that phrase, incentivize to normalize.
Yeah, I definitely wrote that down and was like,
you're welcome.
Thank you.
And Yolanda, is there anything that like Kathryn and I could do to like attend Senate meetings, or if anyone here like wants to attend, or
well,
you
know, I don't know if the presentation is something that I would be able to send people to.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there a link?
Yeah, so we're recording it right now, and I think Aaron said he's going to post it on the website that he shared with all of us early on in the chat. That scholar, what was it?
Yeah, that'll be helpful. Yeah, because for me, all they hear is wah wah wah. I'm the peanuts teacher. Yeah. They'll listen to you though.
Yeah, scholarstrike.com, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I feel like we have more questions than answers, but that's not a terrible place to start.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Other ideas, thoughts, things we're worried about.
Any other ideas for incentives or rewards for teachers or staff making these changes within their offices or in their syllabi or in their curriculum?
No.
All
I think
right.
we're good. Okay, well, we just to kind of wrap up a little bit, we have a couple resources when this goes up on the webpage. We're also happy to just kind of email this out. Things that we kind of found useful in our own thinking. We've got 4 texts here that we think are really helpful. If if you are interested in kind of getting involved, kind of locally, not just at UAlbany, or chapters of what's called Showing Up for Racial Justice. There's one in the Capital District. Cassie and I are both part of it. It is primarily for folks who identify as white, and it's mostly an organization where we partner with sort of Black activists and Black-led organizations, and they say we need 5 volunteers to come hand out water, and we say sure, we'll be there. Or they say we need donations for a book bag drive, and then we jump on that. So that is kind of useful. ITLAL also has this really great workshop coming up on the 17th. We can send you details, or you can go to ITLAL if you want, about how to engage students in discussion on controversial topics. So we think that might also be useful. Yeah, and then that was that. And yeah, and that's basically it. Ta-da! Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. I feel like this was super productive. I really appreciate how many people are already doing this work. Far more articulated ideas of how to do this than we do. So if you want to get involved with our kind of little group, or you have ideas, please feel free to reach out to either me or Cassie.
Yeah, we're with our book club / working group, we're trying to get together every other month, every 2 months or so, depending on our schedules, to identify a new book or a new text or a new source of knowledge, interrogate it, and then try to apply that into our workplace or our daily lives. So if that sounds like something you're interested in doing, feel free to reach out to Kathryn or I to be a part of it. If you want Kathryn and I to, again, Yolanda, come to a union meeting, come to a faculty meeting or something, please let us know. The more people we can get involved, the more capacity we can build, for this movement for change. So
Great,
again,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Right. Thanks, Erin. I wasn't sure.
Thanks.
Erin, did you need to say any closing remarks or stop recording? Can we stop recording, Kathryn?
He says he'll stop the meeting, so we're good. Yeah.
Okay.
Talk to you later, y'all.
All
Thanks.
right.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.